In 722 AD, a handful of rebels in a mountain cave ignited a war that would last nearly 800 years. After the year 711 AD, the Iberian Peninsula changed forever. In just a few astonishing years, Muslim forces from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and defeated the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Hispania for centuries. Cities fell one after another. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was taken. Noble families fled or submitted. To many observers, it seemed that the conquest was complete and irreversible. Al-Andalus was born, and the Umayyad governors believed that Iberia was now securely under their control. But history often turns not on great victories, but on what survives after defeat. In the far north of the peninsula, beyond the wide plains and wealthy cities, lay a rugged land of mountains, forests, and narrow valleys. This region, later known as Asturias, was poor, isolated, and difficult to control. Roman authority had never fully penetrated it, and Visigothic kings ruled it more in name than in reality. For the conquerors of Iberia, this land seemed unimportant. There were no great cities to tax, no fertile fields to exploit, and no strategic roads to dominate. That assumption would prove costly. Among the refugees who fled north after the Visigothic collapse was a man named Pelagius, known in Spanish as Peleo. According to later chronicles, Pelagius was a nobleman, possibly a former court official or military leader connected to the old Visigothic elite. What is certain is that he refused to accept the new order. While many chose accommodation, Pelagius chose resistance. At first, this resistance was small and fragile. Pelagius gathered followers not through proclamations of kingship or grand ideology, but through shared survival. Local mountain communities, already accustomed to autonomy, rallied around him. These people were not dreaming of reconquering all of Iberia. Their aim was simpler: to protect their land, their way of life, and their independence. The Umayyad authorities initially paid little attention to this movement. From their perspective, it looked like banditry, not rebellion. Small detachments were sent north to assert control, collect tribute, and suppress unrest. The assumption was that a show of force would be enough. Yet the geography of Asturias worked against any occupying army. Narrow mountain passes limited movement. Dense forests provided cover for ambushes. Communication between units was difficult. Local fighters knew every path, every ridge, every cave. For them, the mountains were not obstacles, but allies. Tensions escalated when Pelagius openly rejected Umayyad authority. According to Christian sources, he refused to pay tribute and defied local governors. Muslim chroniclers, though less detailed, also acknowledge unrest in the northern mountains. What followed was not a major campaign, but a punitive expedition intended to crush resistance and restore order. This expedition moved toward a place called Covadonga, a remote area nestled in the mountains. The name itself, derived from Latin roots, suggests caves and hollows in the rock. It was here that Pelagius and his followers took their stand. Covadonga was not chosen by chance. The terrain was narrow, steep, and dangerous for any conventional army. Large formations could not maneuver easily. Missiles launched from above could cause chaos below. Retreat, once blocked, could become impossible. For a small defending force, it was an ideal position. When the Umayyad force arrived, they expected a swift victory. Numbers and resources favored them. Pelagius, by contrast, commanded only a small group of fighters, drawn from local clans and remnants of Visigothic warriors. Later legends would exaggerate the scale, but the reality was likely modest on both sides. The clash that followed was brief but decisive. Ambushes, terrain, and discipline turned the situation against the attackers. Panic spread, confusion replaced order. What had been intended as a demonstration of power became a withdrawal under pressure. Some sources describe heavy losses, others a disorderly retreat. What matters more than the exact details is the outcome. Pelagius survived, his force remained intact, and most importantly, Umayyad authority failed to assert itself in Asturias. In purely military terms, Covadonga was a small encounter. It did not alter borders overnight. It did not destroy an army or topple a governor, but psychologically its impact was enormous. For the first time since 711, armed Christian resistance had not only challenged Muslim rule, but endured. News of the survival and success of Pelagius spread across the northern regions. Refugees, dissidents, and local leaders saw that submission was not the only option. A nucleus of resistance had formed, anchored not in imperial ambition, but in survival and autonomy. Pelagius soon became more than a rebel leader. He became a symbol. Around him, the foundations of the kingdom of Asturias began to take shape. This was not yet the Reconquista, as later generations would imagine it. There was no unified Christian front, no vision of reclaiming all of Iberia. That idea would come centuries later. What began at Covadonga was something more modest, but more durable: continuity. The survival of an independent Christian polity on Iberian soil. From this small beginning, history would slowly unfold. Kingdoms would rise, alliances would shift, faith, politics, and power would intertwine, but all of it traced back to this moment in the mountains, where defeat gave birth to resistance. Covadonga did not end the conquest of Iberia, but it ensured that it would never be complete. The survival of Pelagius and his followers after Covadonga did not immediately transform the political map of Iberia. There were no sudden conquests or sweeping victories. Instead, what followed was a slow, careful process of consolidation. The mountains that had protected resistance now became the foundation of a new political reality. In the years after 722 AD, Pelagius focused not on expansion, but on survival. Asturias remained a marginal land in the eyes of Umayyad authorities. Its isolation, lack of wealth, and difficult terrain made it a low priority. Governors in Cordoba were far more concerned with maintaining order in major cities and pushing northward into Gaul. This strategic focus gave Pelagius and his successors time to organize, time to legitimize authority, time to turn resistance into rulership. Pelagius ruled as king, though his power was limited and personal rather than institutional. His authority depended on loyalty, kinship, and shared defense rather than bureaucracy. The communities under his influence were small and scattered, but they recognized him as a leader who had proven his ability to protect them. This was the beginning of the Kingdom of Asturias, not as a formal state, but as a living network of alliances. After Pelagius' death, leadership passed to his son-in-law, Favilla, and later to Alfonso I. It was under Alfonso I that Asturias began to change its character. Alfonso was not merely a defender of the mountains. He was a ruler who understood opportunity. During his reign, internal conflicts within Al-Andalus weakened Umayyad control over the northern frontier. Revolts, succession disputes, and administrative strain reduced the ability of governors to project power into remote regions. Alfonso I used this moment carefully. Rather than seeking direct confrontation, he adopted a strategy of selective expansion. Small raids pushed southward into sparsely populated areas. Fortified points were abandoned by Umayyad authorities who saw little value in holding them. Over time, a buffer zone emerged between Asturias and Muslim-controlled territories. Later historians would call this region the Desert of the Douro, and not because it was empty, but because it lacked strong centralized control. This expansion was not driven by ideology alone. It was practical. Controlling valleys and passes increased security. Access to grazing land supported livestock. Settlements could be rebuilt and repopulated by people fleeing instability elsewhere. Each step strengthened the kingdom's resilience. At the same time, Asturias began to develop legitimacy. Rulers presented themselves as heirs to Visigothic authority. This was more than symbolic. By linking their rule to the past, Asturian kings claimed continuity rather than rebellion. They were not inventing a new order, but preserving an old one in exile. This idea would later become central to Reconquista ideology. Religion played a role, but not yet in the dramatic form often imagined. Churches and monasteries were built, serving both spiritual and political purposes. They became centers of learning, record keeping, and administration. Clergy helped frame resistance as moral survival rather than conquest. This framing was crucial in uniting diverse communities under a shared identity. Meanwhile, Al-Andalus evolved into a powerful and sophisticated society. Cities flourished, trade expanded, culture and science advanced. The northern Christian kingdom did not challenge this dominance. It existed on the margins, small and vulnerable, but it endured. What made Asturias different was not strength, but persistence. Each generation inherited not only territory, but memory. Covadonga became more than an event. It became a story told and retold, shaping identity. Over time, chroniclers transformed it into a foundational myth, emphasizing divine favor and destiny. While historians debate these accounts, their impact is undeniable. By the late 8th century, Asturias had secured its position as a permanent political entity. It was no longer a temporary refuge, it was a kingdom. Its borders remained fluid, but its existence was accepted by neighbors and enemies alike. This acceptance marked a turning point. Resistance had become normal. The idea of reconquest was still distant. No ruler in Asturias imagined reclaiming all of Iberia. Their world was regional, not imperial. Yet the mechanisms that would later support the Reconquista were already forming. Military organization, territorial expansion, ideological continuity, and religious identity all took root during this period. Asturias also influenced other regions. Its survival inspired similar patterns of resistance in Navarra, Aragon, and the Pyrenees. Each developed independently, shaped by local conditions. There was no unified movement, but there was a shared reality. Muslim rule in Iberia was not absolute. By the early 9th century, the legacy of Covadonga had matured. It was no longer about Pelagius alone. It was about a tradition of endurance. A small kingdom had proven that history could move slowly, quietly, and against expectations. The Reconquista did not begin with a grand declaration or a single plan. It emerged over generations, shaped by geography, politics, and memory. Asturias was the first proof that survival could become sovereignty. As the kingdom of Asturias stabilized and expanded, the Battle of Covadonga began to change in meaning. What had once been a small and uncertain clash in the mountains slowly transformed into a foundational story. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded over generations, shaped by chroniclers, rulers, and the needs of a growing kingdom. The earliest references to Covadonga are sparse and restrained. Contemporary Muslim sources mention unrest and resistance in the northern mountains but do not describe a dramatic defeat. Christian sources written closer to the events also remain limited in detail. This silence itself is important. It suggests that Covadonga was not immediately understood as a turning point, but rather as one of many frontier conflicts on the edge of a vast political system. It was only later, particularly from the 9th century onward, that Covadonga gained symbolic weight. As Asturias grew stronger and sought legitimacy, its rulers needed a story of origin. Covadonga provided exactly that. It represented survival against overwhelming odds and continuity with the past. Chroniclers began to frame the battle not just as a victory, but as a sign of divine favor and historical destiny. Pelagius, once a local leader, was elevated into a heroic founder. Accounts described him as chosen, protected, and guided. The landscape itself became sacred. The cave of Covadonga was no longer just a tactical position. It became a symbol of refuge and faith. These elements helped transform a minor battle into a moment of cosmic significance. This process was not unique. Throughout history, emerging states have reshaped their origins to serve present needs. Myths are not necessarily false. They are selective. They highlight certain truths while simplifying others. In the case of Covadonga, the truth was endurance. The myth turned endurance into destiny. As centuries passed, the Reconquista gained momentum, new kingdoms emerged, borders shifted, wars expanded in scale and complexity. In this evolving context, Covadonga was retroactively identified as the beginning of a long struggle. Later historians looked back and drew a straight line from that mountain encounter to the fall of Granada in 1492. This narrative was powerful, but it also compressed nearly 8 centuries of diverse experiences into a single arc. Modern historians approach Covadonga with caution. Archaeological evidence is limited. Written sources are biased and separated from the events by time. Estimates of troop numbers vary widely, and some details are likely symbolic rather than factual, yet skepticism does not diminish importance. Instead, it refines it. Covadonga mattered not because of scale, but because of consequence. It marked the survival of an independent Christian authority in Iberia. It created a political and cultural anchor that would influence later developments. Without Asturias, there would have been no Leon, without Leon, no Castile, and without those kingdoms, the later phases of the Reconquista would have unfolded very differently. The myth of Covadonga also shaped identity. It provided a shared memory that united people across generations. It offered meaning during hardship and justification during expansion. As Reconquista ideology hardened in later centuries, Covadonga became a moral reference point. It reminded rulers and warriors that their struggle had ancient roots. At the same time, it is important to recognize what Covadonga was not. It was not a declaration of holy war. It was not a unified Christian uprising. It did not immediately threaten Al-Andalus. The Muslim presence in Iberia remained strong, dynamic, and influential for centuries after 722. Any portrayal of Covadonga as an inevitable beginning oversimplifies history. Instead, Covadonga represents possibility. It shows how history can pivot on survival rather than victory. It demonstrates that political continuity can emerge from collapse. It highlights the role of geography, memory, and narrative in shaping long-term outcomes. Today, Covadonga occupies a unique place in Spanish historical consciousness. It is commemorated not only as a battle, but as a symbol of origins. For historians, it remains a case study in how small events gain large meanings. For audiences, it offers a compelling reminder that history is not only made by empires, but also by communities that refuse to disappear. When we strip away legend and exaggeration, what remains is still remarkable. A fragile resistance endured, a kingdom took shape, a story was told and retold until it became part of a nation's identity. The Reconquista did not begin with certainty, it began with survival. And that survival in a mountain cave called Covadonga echoed across centuries. By the time later generations looked back on Covadonga, the world had changed completely. Kingdoms had risen and fallen. Borders had shifted countless times. What began as a fragile resistance in the mountains had evolved into a long and complex historical process that reshaped the Iberian Peninsula. Yet Covadonga remained at the center of memory, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it preserved. The Reconquista, as we understand it today, was never a single unified movement. It was not planned in advance nor driven by one ideology across 8 centuries. It was a slow unfolding of events shaped by survival, opportunity, and adaptation. Covadonga stands at the beginning of that unfolding, not as a grand declaration, but as a quiet refusal to disappear. What Pelagius and his followers achieved was not conquest, it was continuity. In a moment when political structures collapsed and authority vanished, they maintained an alternative. That alternative allowed Christian rule, language, customs, and institutions to survive on Iberian soil. From this survival came choice, and from choice came history. As Asturias grew into Leon, and Leon into Castile, the memory of Covadonga traveled with them. Kings used it to legitimize rule. Chroniclers used it to explain destiny. Soldiers used it to anchor purpose. Over time, the story gained layers of meaning far beyond the original event. This is how history becomes identity. At the same time, Al-Andalus continued to thrive. For centuries after Covadonga, Muslim-ruled Iberia remained politically dominant, culturally vibrant, and economically advanced. The presence of a northern Christian kingdom did not diminish this reality. Instead, Iberia became a land of coexistence, conflict, and exchange. Science, architecture, philosophy, and trade flowed across frontiers. The Reconquista unfolded within this shared space, not outside of it. Understanding Covadonga requires rejecting simple narratives. It was neither a miracle that instantly changed history, nor an insignificant skirmish without meaning. It was a turning point only in retrospect, shaped by what followed. Its importance lies in sequence, not scale. History is often remembered through decisive moments, but it is built through persistence. Covadonga teaches this lesson clearly. No empire collapsed that day. No borders were redrawn overnight. Yet something endured that might otherwise have vanished. And endurance, repeated across generations, becomes transformation. By 1492, when Granada fell and the Reconquista reached its symbolic end, Covadonga had become legend. 8 centuries separated the cave in the mountains from the palaces of southern Iberia. Yet chroniclers connected them as part of a single story. Whether that story was fully accurate mattered less than the fact that people believed it. Belief shaped action, and action shaped outcomes. Today, Covadonga remains a reminder of how history begins not always with power, but with survival. It shows how geography can protect identity, how memory can outlive empires, and how small communities can influence the course of centuries. The Reconquista did not start with certainty or inevitability. It began with risk, with resistance, with a decision made in the mountains that submission was not the only path forward. In that sense, Covadonga is not just about medieval Spain. It is about history itself, about how the future often grows out of the margins, unseen and underestimated.